It started off as a book that was going to focus mostly on kind of like extremism, and then kind of grew into a book that was more about the young people who don't necessarily become the most extreme examples of how communities struggle, but are growing up in the same context as the people we see in the news headlines. So it kind of it's called Why Young Men, and basically the idea is to look at why young men often make the headlines for being the perpetrators and victims of tragedy, why young men are kind of increasingly detached from mainstream institutions like schools and work, why young men play a decreasing role in families in the West, and also why young men I think are a group that requires more kind of collective attention from European and North American societies. So it kind of starts off in Toronto with kind of the things that I learned growing up in a mostly immigrant community in Brampton, and kind of like follows my career in different places. So communities like Jane and Finch in Toronto, being in New Haven when I was at Yale, Newark, New Jersey, where I worked for the mayor there, Cory Booker, who's now senator, then into Belgium, where I was last year after I had first met you all, and then the idea is to kind of look at kind of young men who are being pulled in different directions. So I think it's maybe helpful to kind of illustrate what kind of experiences that I look at in the book. So I kind of start the book off with my own experience. In the introduction, I talk about what was, at the time, maybe like the most embarrassing day of my life, which is when I had failed the literacy test in school and had to come back a year later to write it. And I was the only grade 11 student that I knew who had to write it. And it was a moment where like my family, my mom in particular, who raised me, had very little influence over my life. I was going to school is mostly emotionally painful more than anything else, especially when you're labeled illiterate and you actually can read and write. And most of my friends were in various stages of kind of the criminal justice system. And so I was at this period of my life where I was not being morally or politically or really in any helpful way influenced by the people around me. And I kind of spent, a few year period just kind of trying all sorts of different things. So I would hang out with friends who were in gangs. I would go to the Nation of Islam Mosque in Toronto, where there were a lot of kind of extremist ideas being preached. I was not working. I was very much, I would say, like off the grid, so to speak. And so I try in the book to focus on people who are in similar situations where it's hard for us as a society to understand what are they going through because they're not connected to the things that we expect to influence our young people, whether that's at home, that's at school, that's at work. We take for granted, I think, that lots of young people are going to be socialized and that the world that we've created will inherently put them in the right places at the right times. But the truth is that lots of young people aren't in those places, I think young men in particular, and because of that, we find them in all sorts of different places that we didn't really appreciate.